Okay, now this is where things get fun. So we've talked about the Enneagram, which is your fundamental needs or desires, but they're conceptualized as needs. We've talked about the Myers-Briggs, which the interplay of makes up the 16 personalities of the 16personalities.com. And we have talked about the big five. I've already spoiled a little bit, and that's what this video is about, which is correlating these three ways of understanding human personality into one thing. And this is something that I've really geeked out about for 12, 10, 8 years. So we talked about the big five. Now, the big five, and I've just been thinking about this for a long time, so I'm skipping over all the ins and outs and finding details and stuff, but the big five almost perfectly correlates over to the Myers-Briggs without even trying very hard. So I don't know if you recall, but the first of the Myers-Briggs is introversion versus extroversion. The first of the big five is just extroversion and how much you range on it. So they don't make it a versus thing. They just say extroversion is a human personality trait, and here's how you range on it. Whereas the Myers-Briggs does a versus, it's extroversion versus introversion. But you could, and that's the first correlation, and it's pretty cut and dry as we can see. So extroversion versus introversion. And if you recall from the Myers-Briggs, they conceptualize it as where you get your energy from. So that is the first correlation between the Myers-Briggs and the big five, and it's pretty obvious in my opinion. The others are less obvious, but because of how long I've been thinking about it, I know they correlate. I just maybe will have a hard time explaining how, but I'll keep trying. The second of the big five, if you recall, is openness, specifically to new ideas and to new experiences, which in my opinion correlates to the second thing in the Myers-Briggs, which is intuition versus observance. So to me, it's how focused are you as opposed to open. How much do you cling to one thing as opposed to being open to a bunch of new things, more specifically ideas. And so being open to a lot of ideas is intuition, which is your, how do you process information? Abstractly, intuitively. And there's almost an infinite amount of things that can be understood abstractly, right? But there's a much smaller amount of things that you can only understand by observing, right? Because your eyes only see what's around you, whereas you could think about, for instance, love, joy, patience, beauty forever, and those are abstract concepts. And that's intuition versus observance, as it's characterized in or conceptualized in the Myers-Briggs, and also as it's conceptualized, to me, it's the same thing with your range of openness in the big five. The third thing, almost once again, the third trait according to the big five almost perfectly correlates over to the third thing that we talked about in the Myers-Briggs, which is thinking versus feeling. But in the big five, they call it agreeableness, which I hate that term, and I'll maybe get to rant about it the way I've been ranting about it in my head for a while. But the third thing that correlates, in my opinion, is, and it's third versus third, Myers-Briggs versus big five, is what's called agreeableness in the big five, which is called thinking versus feeling in the Myers-Briggs. Moving on to the fourth thing, once again, I think it's the fourth thing in Myers-Briggs correlates to the fourth thing in the big five, which is called conscientiousness in the big five. And I've had a hard time explaining what that is, but to me, it's being a judger in the Myers-Briggs. If you're a judger, you're high on conscientiousness, and they're the same thing conceptually. So in the Myers-Briggs, judging versus perceiving is how you approach or use time. Do you like things? Are you decisive or are you opportunistic? In the Myers-Briggs, that's how you would think of it. In the Big Five in the Big Five, it's, are you conscientious? Do you like structure, order? Do you have a high level of disgust? I think is another way that I've heard it explained. So 4 and 4 correlate pretty easily, in my opinion, in the Myers-Briggs versus the Big Five. And then the fifth one, I mean, it's beautiful to me that it's just down the line with the Myers-Briggs and the Big Five, because the fifth thing in the Big Five is neuroticism, which is your level of negative emotion. And if you remember from the video about the Myers-Briggs, the fifth thing in the Myers-Briggs that doesn't determine your personality, but as I said, and I like the way I said it when I said it's how much of yourself you are, right? That's assertive versus turbulent in the Myers-Briggs, and it's called neuroticism in the Big Five. It's your level of negative emotion. Remember, the Big Five is a spectrum of 5 personality traits. The Myers-Briggs does a versus where it's not a spectrum. It's one way that people are versus an opposite way that other people are. And I prefer the Myers-Briggs because it's to me, it's a better reflection of the way people are. I don't think that we're all aiming toward extroversion, openness, agreeableness, and conscientiousness and neuroticism. I think that there are genuine traits that people have, but they can be kind or disagreeable. They can be opportunistic or decisive. It's not a range of one primary trait. At least this is just, maybe it is, and that's fine if that's the way it is. Whatever the research says, then that's what I would go with. And the Big Five is the most used of the personality typologies and traits. It's the most used method of finding out people's personality traits. So I'm not gonna hate on it, but I prefer the Myers-Briggs because it's put in a way that makes more sense to me, and I think will end up being more accurate. And I think that it's deeper because it gives you not just a range, it tells you what the opposite of being judging, for instance, is, and then basically makes being opportunistic just as common or as valid as being judging, and down the line. So I prefer the Myers-Briggs, but the most used is the Big Five, but they correlate to one another. One just uses a range, the other uses a versus, and then even builds out an interplay of, and I'm talking about the Myers-Briggs builds out an interplay, and I think it's called a typology. There's traitology and typology. I'm sorry that I had to include another thing on top of all this, but the Big Five is 5 traits. The Myers-Briggs correlates those 5 traits, but then does an interplay of those 5 traits to determine 16 types or personalities. So I like the Myers-Briggs more, but I like the Enneagram the most, and we will understand why. Okay, so first we have the Big Five. And the Big Five is what we call a traitology. Okay, ology. Got it. And it is made up of 5 personality traits. And once again, it is the most used of the personality stuff that we've talked about. So it's a traitology, and the first trait is extroversion. Second trait is openness. The third trait is agreeableness. The fourth trait is called conscientiousness, which we have had problems understanding, but, oh gosh, am I going to spell this wrong? I think I got it. Conscientiousness. And the fifth is neuroticism, which is your it is your level, not neggle, of negative emotion. So, the big 5, a traitology with 5 traits. The Myers-Briggs takes this deeper. The Myers-Briggs being a traitology and a typology, as it is called, because it gives you 16 types depending on the interplay of the 5 traits: extroversion, openness, agreeableness, conscientiousness, neuroticism. But I'm just going to do this. It's called the MBTI, so we'll say MBTI. MBTI. And it formats the big 5, or the 5 traits of personality, as a versus introversion versus extroversion. Intuition, which I think correlates to openness, versus observation. And then there's thinking versus feeling, and I think feeling is another way of conceptualizing agreeableness. And then there is judging versus perceiving, which correlates to conscientiousness. And then the 5th one is assertiveness versus turbulence. Turbulence correlating to neuroticism, your level of negative emotion. So that's the big 5. And these are traits that are then turned into types, like the INTJ, assertive, for instance. And then that's where we get into the Enneagram. Which is the deepest. Takes the traits and the types and discovers the fundamental need of a person. So, as we've talked about, there are 9 fundamental needs according to the Enneagram, and Ennea means 9, so it's the 9-agram. Now, you might say that doesn't correlate very well to the closest to the Enneagram of the three that we've talked about, being the Myers-Briggs. But I didn't want to say this because I'm just trying to just gloss over this stuff and really get to where we have a fundamental understanding of personality itself, using all the ways that you can conceptualize it or think about it that we know of, and then work with all of it and really discover something better, maybe. And that's where we've arrived at the Enneagram, which is the deepest of the three because it goes after need. When you were a child, you sought something that would keep you safe, that would satisfy you, that was desirable. And the Enneagram tells you what that thing is that you thought would save you, is one way that you could think about it. The thing that you thought would fulfill you, save you, keep you safe and loved and comforted. So as we've talked about, in the Enneagram, which we're going to pull everything back to over time because it's the deepest, there are 9 needs. The first need is the need to be, let's do it this way, perfect. Called the reformer. The second is the need to be needed, called the helper. The third is the need to succeed, achiever. The fourth is the need to be special, called the individualist. The fifth is the need to understand or know. Let's go with understand. They're called the investigator. The sixth need is the need to be secure. And they're called the loyalist. Seventh is the need to avoid pain, specifically pain. And they're called the enthusiast. The eighth of 9 is the need to be against. They're called the challenger. And the last of the 9 is the need to avoid in general. And they're called the peacemaker. And that is the 9 fundamental needs of humans. So, we've covered the traitology of the Big Five, which flows into the traits of the Myers-Briggs, which becomes a typology when you let there be an interplay between the traits. And then we burrow down into, finally, the needs of people. And that's the Enneagram, the 9-agram, the 9 basic needs of humans. Now, you might say that doesn't correlate. The Big Five correlates with the Myers-Briggs, but the Myers-Briggs doesn't correlate to the Enneagram because there's 16 Myers-Briggs types or personalities, and there's only 9 Enneagram needs. Well, this is exciting because there's the Enneagram is widely, as far as I'm aware, people use wings, as they're called, in the Enneagram. Now, that's a new thing that I'm interjecting, so I don't want you to think too deeply about it. So there's 9 needs, and then the assumption is that the different needs are closely related to one another. So a 9 can have a wing of the things next to it, which is an 8 and a 1, and then so forth. The 2 has 1 and 3 next to it, so it can be a 2 wing 1 or a 2 wing 3. The 5 has a 6 and a 4 next to it, so it can be a 5 wing 4 or a 5 wing 6. And then they're all that way, which makes up 18, and there's 16 personalities according to the Myers-Briggs. So here we have the Enneagram with its wings, and because it's 9 needs with a wing on each side, it comes out to 18 personalities. So that funnels nicely from the MBTI. So, does it correlate any further? Yes. And this is where you're going to have to trust me after thinking about this for years. And a few years ago, I correlated the 16 Myers-Briggs personalities to the 18 Enneagram types if you include the wings, which most people do include the wings. So let's start with 1 wing 9. So here we have the 1, driven by perfection, the need to be perfect. So what's the correlated Myers-Briggs to a 1 wing 9? And just so you know, I've seen differing opinions on what the correlations are, but I respect people that have correlated them because it took me years, and I was thinking about it constantly while it was taking years, and then I finally correlated it. So I respect other people's correlations, and some of them are very close to mine, but I feel very strongly about the ones I've correlated. But once again, the purpose of this is understanding about yourself and people. So what's the 1 wing 9 Myers-Briggs? It is an INTJ. Now, you're going to notice, I'll just spoil it, with each one of them, 3 out of 4, and it just turned out this way, that 3 out of 4 of the Myers-Briggs traits are going to be the same for each of the 9 buckets of personalities. So I'll give an example. The 1 wing 9 is an INTJ, and then a 1 wing 2 is an ISTJ. So introverted observant rather than introverted intuitive. So here we have the 1 wing 2 correlated as an ISTJ, and then, like I was trying to explain, there's 3 out of the 4 in common: introverted thinking and judging, introverted thinking and judging. And the point I was trying to make earlier is that it turns out, this is just the way it turned out, and this is something that's fascinating to me, that in each of these buckets, the 1s, the 2s, the 3s, the 4s, all the way to 9, 3 of the 4 always correlate. So in the instance of a 1, introversion, thinking, and judging makes up, as you can see here, introverted, thinking, judging, introverted, thinking, judging. Those 3 human traits seem to characterize what it looks like to be driven by perfection. And it makes sense if you think about it for a long time. So, moving on. What is a two-wing one? Two-wing one is an ESFJ. Two-wing three is an ENFJ. And what is the three that are in common? Extroversion, feeling, and judging. So extroversion, feeling, and judging characterize what it looks like cognitively to be driven by the need to be needed. Okay, moving on. The Enneagram 3-wing 2, ESTJ. And then 3-wing 4 is an ESTP. And we can see that extroversion, observance, and thinking characterize what it looks like cognitively to be driven by success and the need to succeed. Moving on to the Enneagram 4, 4-wing 3. And this is where I'll state that you may have noticed that there's not a perfect correlation because there's 16 MBTIs and 18 Enneagrams. So what that means is, and this perplexed me for a while, it means that you're going to use one of the MBTIs, well, two of the MBTIs twice. And I'll just spoil that as well. That it's at the INFP, 4-wing 3, and the 9-wing 8. So the INFP and, the 9-wing 8 and the 4-wing 3 are both INFPs. And so it cognitively looks the same to be a 9-wing 8. You're in the same state of mind to being a 9-wing 8 and being a 4-wing 3. And this is where I'll say this is my opinion. So I saw that other people have done this, and I think one of them actually did it the same way I did, which is reassuring. So 4-wing 3 is the INFP. And then very similar, as is usual, the 4-wing 5 is an ISFP, with the defining factor of a 4 being introversion, feeling, and perceiving. Okay, what about the 5? The need to understand. The 5-wing 4 is ISTP. And then the 5-wing 6 is INTP, which makes the defining characteristic of an Enneagram 5 introversion, thinking, and perceiving. Moving on to the Enneagram 6, the need to be secure. I have the 6-wing 5 being an ISTJ. And you'll notice that that is the other one that's used twice. 1-wing 2 is also an ISTJ. So INFP is used twice with 9-wing 8 and 4-wing 3, and ISTJ is used twice with a 1-wing 2 and a 6-wing 5. So cognitively, it looks very similar or the same to be driven by perfection and to be driven by security. Specifically, 1-wing 2 and 6-wing 5. Okay. 6-wing 7 is, as you would expect, very similar to 6-wing 5. 3 in common, as is going to be across the board, with the 3 in common of a 6 being introversion, observance, and judging. Okay, Enneagram 7, the need to avoid pain. 7 wing 6 is ESFP, and 3 in common, ENFP, with the 3 defining traits of a 7 being extroversion, feeling, and perceiving. Moving on to the Enneagram 8, the need to be against. We have ENTP and ENTJ, with the 3 defining characteristics of an 8 being extroversion, intuition, and thinking. Lastly, we have the Enneagram 9, the need to avoid, and we already covered 9 wing 8, which is the same as 4 wing 3, which is introverted, intuitive, feeling, and perceiving. And then 3 in common is the INFJ, the 9 wing 1.